After the event today, we're going to drop you an email, and that email is going to have on it the slides, copy of the slides that you'll see today. But also what we'd really value from you is your feedback from today. We'd like to run these events regularly throughout 2021, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about how we can shape those best, and what are some of the topics that you'd love to be exploring together. What are some of the ways in which you'd like to do that? So we would love you to respond to that email and to give us some feedback as we run those events. I'm going to hand over to Josh. He's going to say hi and tell us a little bit about how the questions and answers are going to work a bit later on.
Thank you, Ed. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Josh Kingston, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be the charities partner here at Burton Suite, and to be working alongside two such leaders in the charity and civil society sector as Ed and Cecile. As Ed hinted, we've got a slightly different way of doing Q&A today, as we used to do in the past, perhaps passing a microphone around the room. But today, once Ed and Cecile have had a look at some of the current key issues that we might all be facing, there'll be a chance, to do some Q&A. As there are so many of us here today, we might not be able to get to all the questions in the time provided. However, please do write in the chat for everyone to see below. If you just have a little look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little icon which says chat next to it. If you click on that and then type your question in, I've already posted something there which just says welcome. Please do post your questions here, so you can sort of write below that, and also a hello from Helen Taylor there as well, so thank you, Helen. And if you just post there any question that occurs to you as Ed and Cecile are talking, or a more general question perhaps that's going on sort of in the wider charity sector, or maybe in the sort of area that your charity is facing, then I will sort of collate those questions a bit together and pick and choose some good ones for Ed and Cecile sort of towards the end of our session, and I'll pose those questions to them, and we'll see what we can get through. And if there are some good ones that we can sort of gather together in our sort of post event communication, then we'll do that as well. And if there's some really specific ones, we'll see if we can respond to you individually on that afterwards as well. So wonderful. Am I handing back to you, Ed, or is
yes? Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ed. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes sort of taking us through the first part of our content before handing over to Cecile. And I want to talk a little bit to you about charities in a COVID-19 world. You know, we're all, of course, getting used to doing things in a very different way, and it's been a very challenging time. You know, what are some of the key issues that are coming out for charities during this time? I mean, there's the obvious issue, which I didn't even deem to be worthy of putting on a slide, which is that the importance of good broadband is obviously been really key as we've all got used to being online. But actually, of course, in the sector, and I don't know what your experience is, but actually there are many challenges, particularly actually around finances and how we manage financial difficulties. That we're in a situation for many of us where actually our ability to fundraise has been limited severely by just operationally, or actually just because it's just simply not appropriate at this point to be kind of asking people for support. Actually, we know that the general state of the economy is challenging, and will become more and more challenging as time goes on, and that's going to make life very difficult financially for charities operating in that environment. We know that for many of us, we've needed to suspend in-person activities. We've had to suspend a lot of the things we're doing because of the control restrictions that there have been over the last few months. We know that some of our trading activities are not being able to take place. So we've lost sources of trading income, and we've not quite been sure where we go. So there's those issues, of course, for us to face. And then, of course, so many trustees are faced with this incredible dilemma between prioritizing the short term and the long term. You know, in reality, for many organizations, of course, actually sources of income have gone down and dried up, but the need has skyrocketed. There's been an explosion of the need for amongst their beneficiaries, and that creates real challenges. The dilemma is, do we sort of restrict what we do now for the benefit of our long-term work and our long-term support of beneficiaries, or do we continue to try and sustain and plough in our resources now to help this great need knowing that actually that might mean that we might not be around in a couple of years' time. And that is a very difficult choice for trustees to make, that acting in the best interests of the charity and balancing the needs of current and future beneficiaries. Maintaining good governance, it's a double whammy, really, because on the one hand, there's more governance challenges than at any time before. And yet on the other hand, we have real limitations on being able to physically meet together and to be able to dialogue together, to be able to make those good decisions. And Cecile's going to remind us about good governance a little bit later on. Actually, it's really challenging for many charities in terms of pursuing their charitable purposes. It's been great to see some creative responses that charities make to the needs in the world at the moment. But actually, a lot of the issue that charities have got to be asking themselves is, are we allowed and should we be using our resources to further a charitable purpose that might not be squarely within what we have been set up to do? And that's a real challenge for people. Safeguarding is a massive challenge. I think a reminder to us today that we can easily think of safeguarding as all about children and vulnerable adults. In reality, charity trustees have a safeguarding duty to anyone that comes into contact with the charity. And of course, in these times, the importance of keeping people safe, the importance of doing things in a sensible way and in a safe way is so vital. You have a safeguarding duty to your staff as well as to your beneficiaries, to your volunteers as well as your beneficiaries. And so those are real challenges at this time. The risks of fraud and particularly cybercrime have gone through the roof during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But of course, accounting and reporting, how do we tell the story well? That's a real challenge. Are we going to be charities that learn the lessons from this crisis? It's easy, isn't it, to close your eyes and to sort of just kind of hope that it's all going to be over and it's all going to pass and we're all going to go back to normal very soon. But actually, what are we learning from this time? And I've spoken to many charities who are saying, oh, actually, our trustees meetings are really efficient on Zoom, and there's certain ones of those meetings, they just seem to work really well. Others, yeah, we won't do that. But actually, things like that, a lot of people are saying, do we really need all this office space? Do we need these resources that we've got in the same way? Can we actually do things in a better way? Are we going to be people that learn the lessons and not just hunker down and hope for the best? I'm going to share with you a quote, which I've been toying whether to show this because it seems perhaps slightly unfair to share a quote from 7 months ago. But this is a quote from the chair of the Charity Commission, Baroness Stahl, back in the Times in June last year. The pandemic has merely reinforced the fundamental challenges charities face rather than change them. I don't know how you feel about that quote. I've got mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, I feel it a little, if I'm honest, just a little bit like it downplays the significance of this time. Obviously, it's back in June. That potentially it kind of, it's a bit of a kick in the teeth, perhaps sometimes for charities. And yet, on the other hand, I sort of kind of get what she means, that actually charities that are proactive, charity trustees that are on the ball with their duties and responsibilities and managing a charity well, are the ones that are best equipped to deal with kind of the more extreme nature of what we're going through. And I think, one of the ways that is illustrated, I think, particularly is through financial management, that those that are very active and proactive in their financial management are better equipped to deal with a crisis. I want to just draw your attention to CC25. This is Charity Commission Guidance CC25. And in my view, this is one of the most underused and underappreciated bits of guidance on the Charity Commission website, because it really acts as a sort of a one-stop shop for many questions that people have got around finance and the key topics. It's a bit like a launching pad, a landing platform. And I just want to draw your attention to this. There's a whole range of topics that come from this guidance. And actually, in terms of reinforcing the challenges and the tasks that charity trustees have already got in front of them, this is a great place to be looking. But how do we manage charity finance in uncertain times? And I just want to go right back to basics with you for a minute and just say some things that we think at Burton Sweet are really, really important around financial management. And that is that it's really important that you understand your current situation. It's really important that you have a handle on what you've got. You can only manage something that you can see. You can only manage something that you know that you're managing. And so you do need to make sure that you have accurate and up-to-date financial information. And to be honest with you, there's a bit of a trade-off between accurate and up-to-date, because on the one hand, we want our management information, our picture of the finances of the charity to be correct and to be as accurate as possible. But actually, if that takes a couple of months to pull together, that's not really going to help us. So how do we get that right balance between timely and accurate? And I think so often there's just a need to get that balance right. You need to understand the nature of the funds that you hold. You understand what of your funds are restricted funds that are legally bound to the purpose for which they were given. Which of your funds are designated funds that are set aside by the trustees for a particular purpose that you might actually want to consider drawing back and to using for other purposes. Understanding your funds is critical to knowing your position. You want to understand the nature of your income and your costs. What are your costs of a fixed nature? You know, what are the contractual obligations that you have? What are the ways in which you can have actually some flexibility around your income and your costs? We can learn an awful lot from the commercial world, where we know and we understand that the vast majority of businesses that fail because they run out of cash. And so what's really important for us as charities of any size is to always be keeping an eye on cash, being aware of our cash position in the context of the overall picture. Let's be aware of our obligations that are coming up, the things that are coming up, and just even some very simple forecasting is an essential part of financial management. And then proactive communication, a need to make sure we're talking to those for whom we depend on or whom are depending on us for finances, whether that's landlords, funders, donors, whether that's creditors, or whether that's partners that we're working with. And it might be that you're here on the call and actually your challenge as a charity is that you are right on the very, very edge, that actually the pandemic has caused real hardship for the charity. And just a couple of comments here. It's you know, we would love to have a chat to you and to just to help you, but you know, developing both recovery and closure plans is a really, really important thing. It's not really very easy to make a choice, a sensible choice, unless you can see both of those things in front of you and understand the costs that will be involved in trying to see some kind of turnaround and recovery and what the cost of closure would be. And then in particular, be a bit careful around this, but take advice on how is it that there's been relaxations in insolvency law. The Corporate Solvency and Governance Act is really helpful in many ways. There's, you know, a temporary suspense of the wrongful trading provisions until 30th of April 2021. You know, to what extent do you lean and rely on that? It's really important to consider that very, very carefully. A very quick word on fraud. Fraud is on the rise in a time of crisis, particularly email phishing scams. We just want to say to you, just be on your guard. A training for staff and volunteers at every level, whether they're finance staff or not, is a really important thing to do. And there's some great resources out there. I can point you towards the Charity Fraud Awareness Hub. There's some really helpful webinars and help sheets and checklists and things there. We've signposted some of those in the slides. And then just some tips for you. So you're going away with something to think about and to do. Increase that awareness. Make sure your staff are aware of the risk. The email phishing risk it's really an epidemic, if I can use that word, in the charity sector. There's lots of it about. Make sure you are regularly backing up your systems. Make sure your patching is up to date, that all the updates are happening. This is advice, by the way, from the head of counter fraud and cybercrime unit at the Charity Commission. And then passwords, really, really important. Use them, definitely use passwords. Always change the default ones. Apparently the latest thinking is don't enforce all your staff and volunteers to change their passwords regularly. That's a sure sign that they'll end up choosing really, really easy passwords or choosing the same password across all of their devices. It's actually much better to have a password written down in a safe place than it is to have a really easy password that's easy to crack. So go for that. And then just a very quick bit of trivia for you here. How long do you think it takes for a bit of software to crack these passwords? The first one looks pretty difficult, doesn't it? That would take software 15 seconds to crack. The second one would take 6 hours. The third one would take 6.5 years. The best way to do passwords is 3 completely unrelated words and a couple of other characters. Now, please don't go away and change all your passwords to coffee, tiny fish, #9, because that probably is not a very sensible thing to do. Just finally, before I hand over to Cecile, on the accounting and reporting front, there is some SORP guidance that was issued right at the very start of the pandemic, back almost a year ago now, in March, on the 22nd of March 2020. And this was really helping preparers of accounts and preparing trustees. How should we be reporting on this pandemic in our accounts? Strangely, or perhaps comfortingly, it's advisory only, it's not compulsory. I think our view, we also take a reasonably skeptical view to anybody who wants to leave it out, to be honest with you. The idea that you can have a major global pandemic and not mention it in your accounts is probably bordering on, well, I won't use a word, but I think you really should be including something in your accounts about the global pandemic. And so their guidance here is really helpful, but really it just states the obvious. It says, actually, in your trustees annual report, this global pandemic is all pervasive. It affects every area of a charity's operations, finances, staff, resources, future plans, its ability to fundraise, its beneficiaries. It affects everything. So therefore, explain and justify. Tell the story, explain what that impact has been and the work that the charity trustees have been doing. It's not even worth putting that list there, because you just need to talk about what it is the impact the pandemic having. And then for the technical bods amongst us, those that are on the call desperate for a bit of double entry or something like that, quick final slide here to say, what are some of the accounting issues that we are facing at this time as we prepare management accounts, but actually also as we think about our year-end accounts and think about our public reporting. For many of us, we'll have established cost allocation methodology where we spread our staff costs over particular activities, or there's sort of overhead costs or supporting costs that we include within costs of contracts and our costing. Actually, this is the time to review those allocations, to decide to yourself, oh, actually, is our use of resources over this year been so different that actually we need to change the basis of which we are reporting. So do pay attention to that. Many of us have received income under the coronavirus job retention scheme. We get asked the question quite a lot, how do we account for that? Do get in touch with us if you want to hear a bit more about this, but the basic principle is this: in the SORP, you never net things, you never sort of offset it against the cost. Instead, you say, actually, this is a grant, this is grant income, we recognize it for the period to which it relates, and we still carry the full cost of our staff as an expense. So it's a grant income and it's an expense. And with a small, if you're being the recipient of a small business grant, treat that as grant income in the normal way. It's usually not time limited at all, so you just treat it, you bring it in at the point at which it is receivable. There's a whole area around, if you've received a concessionary rent arrangement for property that you are renting. And there's a whole pronouncement, and it's horribly technical, but really it simply says this: recognize the benefit, recognize the reduced cost at the time at which that reduced cost is for. Don't go spreading it over the whole life of a lease or the period to the first rent review, or if you're thinking about it in those kind of terms. And also make sure that you are only including any concessions that are commercial concessions. They're not sort of charitable discounts that you are offered, because that's not covered by that. Be very clear on the difference between waived staff costs and deferred staff costs. It might be that you have had key staff turn around to you and say, I'm willing to waive my pay at this time. Actually, that waiver is a donation to the charity. It's a donation in kind, and you continue to carry the full cost and recognise a donation. That's very different to a deferred staff cost, where there's a delay in payment of staff, which is just treated in the normal way. Do ask more about that. Do come to us and ask more. Do be clear on the recoverability of any cancelled events, the costs that relate to those. And if they're cancelled, can we get the money back? Should we be including that and recognising that? And then, of course, absolutely fundamental to charity accounts is the basis on which they are prepared. Are the accounts to be continued to be prepared on a going concern basis? Are we going to be continue in existence for the foreseeable future and continuing operation? And so it's really important to stand back and be asking that question: are we going to prepare our year-end accounts on a going concern basis? Because we, as your independent examiners or auditors or whoever they are, we'll be asking you what your assessment is of your future prospects. In this uncertain world, it's a very challenging question to answer, and yet it's one that we need to get to grips with and understand the impact of. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Cecile, who's going to take us through some other topics.
Thank you, Ed. Let's have the first slide. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you all. So I'm going to start with some thoughts around meetings, particularly, firstly, the latest COVID-19 restrictions, the restrictions on movement because of the lockdown. Now, that does mean that most meetings in person are not permitted, but there has been some updating of the Charity Commission guidance on this, and it's reflecting the government guidance that we are allowed to have some activity where it's necessary to provide voluntary and charitable services. And I know that some of your organisations and some of your people are involved in that community support. So have a look. You can click through from the Charity Commission amended guidance to the detailed government guidance about when it's permissible to leave home and be part of gatherings in order to deliver services to support our communities. Besides that, the temporary, and I do stress temporary, legal measures that allow some charities to hold members' meetings digitally have been extended to 31st March. That's not very long now. It only applies to charitable incorporated organisations, charitable companies and community benefit societies. And it does enable them to use phone or video or other electronic mechanisms for members' meetings. The rights of your members to vote are preserved, but a member can't insist on voting in person. The charity can require use of electronic voting methods. Other types of charity are absolutely not able to rely on these temporary measures. And again, I stress they're temporary. They're going to run out quite soon now. So this is really only a holding position. I'll come to the long-term solution in a minute. The temporary changes don't apply to trustees' meetings, so you need to think about what the governing document says and whether it facilitates any kind of virtual meeting participation. An awful lot of them don't, and be careful about that because you may well have no governing document authority. The Charity Commission said that if you absolutely have to hold trustees' meetings by electronic methods when you don't have authority, then they'll be understanding, but they do want you to record your decision. And I think that the long-term solution is reviewing governing documents and thinking about changes to bring them up into the modern age for flexibility, not just to look at the pandemic. There's a great risk of looking at the big immediate issue before us. I think it's about looking at flexibility for the future. And we're helping a number of our clients with changes at the moment. Some of you indeed will be having those conversations with us, and we'd encourage you to have more of those conversations. On the filing deadlines, the statutory filing deadline with the Charity Commission for your annual return, of course, is still, as it always was, at 10 months. And the Commission is encouraging us all to meet that deadline, please. If you absolutely can't because of urgent COVID issues, you can apply to them for an extension. But really, I think by now we should all have kind of organised ourselves that we're meeting the deadline. And I'd encourage you to file as soon as you can, really, in terms of when your filing time limit naturally comes up. For companies, at the moment, there's still an automatic extension to the usual 9-month filing deadline with Companies House, and that runs up until the 5th of April. So if your end point would have normally been 5th of April for your usual time limit, you've got this 12-month extension, but after the 5th of April, the usual time limit's going to apply again. And there's been a little bit of extension on the confirmation statement deadline, 42 days rather than 14 days. Again, all these are actually temporary measures, and we can look forward at some point to them being released. Next slide, Ed, thank you. So in terms of encouraging volunteering, our community support through volunteering is a really big focus for many of our charities. And I know, again, many of you are involved in that as effort to support our communities through the pandemic, as well as to actually counter the pandemic itself. Fascinating and wonderful that 65% of the people on the New Year's Honours list got an award for undertaking outstanding work in their communities, largely as volunteers. That's a great plaudit for our sector. The Royal Voluntary Service website has a portal for people who want to volunteer, particularly with the NHS responders, and there's still a need for that. And that might be a scheme that you can still be pointing some of your people to. And some other material too, of course, about volunteering opportunities through them. And then the national response to provide volunteers to help with the COVID-19 vaccination programme, which again is ongoing and growing. St John Ambulance is the lead charity recruiting for that. And you'll again find a portal on their website that you can use to show an expression of interest and sign up. And I'd encourage people to do that. I have people in my immediate circle of contacts who've done it, and magnificent they are too. To help you equip your volunteers for safe working during this time, the British Red Cross has got a free online self-learning training course, and that's worth pointing out to your people and encouraging them to use. Much bigger picture volunteering, NCVO has just published its annual survey, which analyses the operating context for the voluntary sector. This year's one is entitled The Road Ahead. It's looking at forces and trends that are drivers in political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal areas. And it helps us to understand the setting in which we're operating. In terms of the UK now having left the European Union and the impact of the Brexit transitional period having ended, it points, for example, to the changes that are likely in employment regulation, especially for organisations recruiting and employing people from the EU, the adjustments to data protection law, and changes to environmental law, and indeed much else. It's a really good contextual document to help you think about your strategic planning for 2021. And I think how you use your volunteers within that strategic planning is important in the context of understanding where we are or at the moment and where we're likely to be going. Next slide, Ed, thank you. Ed's quite rightly highlighted the importance of charity governance for us all at this time, and to get our governance right and to look at it. There's been some changes to the Charity Governance Code. Just a reminder of the context here. This is a practical tool to help trustees and their charities develop high standards of governance. It's not compulsory, it's not law, but it is strongly recommended, and it's particularly strongly recommended by the Charity Commission that you should follow the code. And the code is structured with principles, 7 of them, underneath a top-level principle that focuses on trustees' commitment to the charity's cause and delivery of its purposes for the public benefit. And then underneath the principles, there are examples of good practice guidance, recommendations and suggestions that you can adapt to your circumstances. The 2 principles that have particularly changed, firstly, the integrity principle and the supporting recommendations. This has had a significant refocus, and this has had much less publicity than the second one that's on the slide. It's a significant refocus away from just the correct treatment of your funds and assets, important though that is, to bring in trustee behaviours. So it's been strengthened to emphasise the importance of a charity's values, to focus on ethical decision-making by your trustees, and the culture that those things create. It's important, therefore, that we're looking at creating a welcoming and supportive culture to help achieve our charity's purpose. And our trustee decisions and our trustee actions need to be consistent with the charity's ethical values. And when you're thinking about your charity's ethical values, what is it that is special about those for your charity? I'd encourage you to use the NCVO Charity Ethical Principles to help put this into practice. That's absolutely designed to work with the Charity Governance Code to help you. So the changes put a new emphasis on the right for everyone who comes into contact with the charity to be part of the charity and to do that in a safe way. On the equality principle, this has been widened to include diversity and inclusion. And those are really important concepts that have been brought into play. Inclusion is talking about good practice recommendations where we're encouraging and facilitating an everyone welcome situation in our charity. It's not just about the composition and operation of your board, important again, though both of those things are. It extends to making inclusion a priority in the charity's activities and making inclusion a priority in relation to the access for benefits to your beneficiaries. How can people take part? Indeed, how can they be included even as volunteers in your charity? How can you take away the barriers for participation? Putting this into action needs you to do some thinking about your charity's context. How can discouraging perspectives be removed, the barriers lowered? How can any imbalances of power and imbalances of opportunity be addressed? 10% of the nation still doesn't have any online access, for example. So how can we make it easier for people to be included? Thank you, Ed. The next slide. Some other legal roundups and things that your boards will need to be making sure your charity is paying attention to. The Information Commissioner's Office has published a new data sharing code of practice, and it's expected to come into force later this year. How will it be used when it comes into force? Well, the ICO will use it when it's considering whether organisations have complied with the data protection law and principles on sharing personal data. It'll be a measure against which you're, as it were, tested. And the code's underlying aim is to give guidance on responsible data sharing that's fair and transparent and secure. There's a strong emphasis that you should carry out a data protection impact assessment when you're considering data sharing. Effectively, this is a risk assessment and it needs to focus on potential high-risk areas to individuals. On safeguarding, the new code emphasises that children's data should not be disclosed unless you can demonstrate a compelling reason to do so in the interests of the child. So the start point is don't. Some practical actions for you in relation to this. Although the code isn't in force yet, I'd suggest that you need to be working through a work programme now. Think about reviewing any data sharing agreements you already have in place, checking if there are any sharing agreements that you haven't properly documented so that you can work up a work programme on that. If you're having any restructuring of your organisation or any restructuring of your activities, then think about the lawful basis on which you're holding and using data, particularly if it's going to be moved around to new systems. If you're thinking about adjusting the purposes, remember there may be a need to go back and inform individuals. There may sometimes be a need to get fresh consents or at least to revisit the lawful basis on which you're going to make the changes and use the data. And don't overlook the security issues. Ed gave you some very helpful tips on that. Very, very important to address those, especially if systems are changing or indeed different users will be using the data. If you're thinking about acquiring databases and contact lists, do your due diligence. The code identifies key checks, such as ensuring the data is not excessive or irrelevant for your needs. And again, those are useful lessons to learn and to bring to bear. I think the final thing I just mentioned, and we're going to talk about this probably in a future one of these sessions in more detail, the Charity Commission's very recently announced that it is now going to look at ethical investing, and it's doing a public consultation through the spring to try and bring up to date into the modern age some of its guidance on that. Would really encourage people to engage with that. We're certainly going to do that and encourage charities to do so. That's a whistle stop through some and only some things. Back to you, Ed.
Thanks so much, Cecile. It's really helpful. We're going to have a bit of time now to just sort of share things that perhaps questions that people have been asking in the chat. Just to say as well, it doesn't have to be a question. If you would like to, just make a comment on your experience or share a resource that you would love other people to be able to benefit from as well. So sort of hints and tips, things, do share them in the chat. And Josh is beavering hard to pick things up, and he'll ask us a few things, share a few things for us. I'll have a little look through as well. But Josh, over to you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Cecile. Thank you, Ed, for your talks there. That was fantastic. We do have some questions. I think we've had a couple that just came off of the back of what you were talking about, Cecile. I don't know if it's good to maybe talk about that first of all, and then hit a few more of the general questions. So just talking about managing data for individuals, and there's a question about, what about data management for staff who may longer be working for the charity, or perhaps even the data in regards to applicants for jobs for the charity themselves? Is that handled differently at all?
Well, there's two things really these are global points. This is not specific to the situation. You need to come and chat about that. But the global points, remember, are that you can only gather data for purposes that are necessary and only hold it for as long as is necessary, with one limited exception, which is if there's a legal requirement to hold the data, to continue to hold the data, you can. So there's some careful judgment calls to be made about how long you keep things. Is there a formal legal reason you must, in which case you must? If not, then you need to think about systems to weed out data when you no longer have a justifiable reason for keeping it.
Thank you, Cecile. I've had a couple of comments. It's worth probably just noting at this point, when we were getting onto the passwords, perhaps not a question for you two, but there's definitely some points being made about the longer the better for the password. And there's even a link there if anybody wants to see it in the chat on, I think there's a how secure is my password.net, which might be a bit of a password generating sort of.
It sounds as though we've got some real experts.
Yeah,
I don't know what the wisdom of me making comments on passwords, given the fact I'm an accountant rather than an IT expert. But yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that blew my mind was the concept that actually it is true when you think about it. The idea of actually writing down a password somewhere safe and secure, of course, is much more secure than just having this crazy simple password like password or Burton Suite or something like that. So yeah, just some interesting ones.
In terms of resources, there's lots of things online, and they're not all actually as trustworthy as they might on the face of it appear. So be careful about which sources you go to for help on this. My start points would be the National Cybersecurity Centre, the National Fraud Squad, and indeed City of London Police as well. Start there and work your way down from them. And GCHQ actually has some material, I believe, as well.
Some great resources, all freely available. Some great training things. Some good, sort of whilst staff are at home, give them a little webinar to watch. There's a number of those available free, particularly from listed on the slides. But Cecile just mentioned them as well.
Perhaps a little bit specific, but I think it caught a few people off guard. The CGRS scheme. I think it caught a few people unawares that perhaps it might be restricted income. I was wondering if you could perhaps think about that. And there was a question about whether it counts towards subsidy limits, as it's a grant perhaps rather than something else. So
yeah, so again, my understanding is that CGRS grants are always unrestricted, but it might very well be that that actually there's staff within a restricted project that you need to kind of transfer costs over to cover, or you need to transfer over income to funds over into that fund to cover. But actually the grant income in itself is not, it's not the government says, here's grant income that is absolutely must got to be used for this purpose. It's simply you have fulfilled the eligibility requirements to be able to claim this particular grant. So my understanding is it is not restricted, it is an unrestricted grant receipt. I think that I would say that's the general position. I must confess, I'm not 100% certain what the question is about subsidy. Perhaps you could just clarify.
It could be a bit of a specific situation. So maybe if we follow that up another time, because I know that does come in some charities, or perhaps slightly more on the commercial side, that you can reach some limits with on how much grant income you can have in
Oh, I see.
So
I think it's around the public procurement rules, probably.
Oh, okay.
And just a global point there, they are likely to be changing because of the changes post-Brexit.
Yeah, I think the general point would be we're living in exceptional times. I don't know whether there can be a relaxation in that kind of way. Sorry not to be precise in our answer, but yeah.
We've had a few questions about the guidance on meetings. One of which was where governing documents don't sort of dictate how AGMs should be held. Can we assume that there's nothing to stop sort of virtual meetings going ahead? I think there has been some guidance released. Is that right, Cecile?
Well, the legal point is you can't assume that. Be really careful that although the Charity Commission is being quite sort of generous in its comments, it's actually skating over some really difficult legal points. So the answer to your question is no, you can't assume that, and you absolutely shouldn't. And I think one of the other ones, Dan Green was asking the guidance on carrying on work, supporting the communities. Dan, that's accessible on the government website, and you can click through from the Charity Commission website on the latest COVID guidance on meetings, as in meetings to do activities. That's where you need to go. And there's a description on the government website in more detail about the community support that is permissible. So it's the government website you need to look at.
Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I thought perhaps just a more general point that might help people at this time. It is a very challenging time for all charities. Is there any sort of quick hints and tips, I suppose, on sort of looking for trustees in this environment? Because it might be quite a challenging time. I know it's a sort of perennial question for everyone.
Cecile, do you want to go first on that one? Or?
Yeah, sorry, Jesh, could you just repeat that one?
Yeah, certainly. Any hints or tips on sort of recruiting trustees in this challenging time?
Yeah, now that's an interesting question. Some of the, over time, and this was happening even before we got to COVID, a lot of the resources where we could, for example, post vacancies have sadly been disappearing. So you need to narrow down your search, I'm afraid, to those sources that are still there if you're thinking about advertising. No magic bullets really on that. We've got a few sources we can point you to, but they are, I'm afraid, a bit in terms of that, put it into the public domain.
I've got a question here, which is to do with sort of managing. Just finding it 1 second. It's to do with managing staff on furlough.
Say thank you, Quentin, for your contribution there. It's great to hear. It's a good news story. We've actually recruited 2 trustees during COVID. The ability to meet online has been attractive to them. I think that's a very interesting point. I think I think for many boards, attendance has gone up at board meetings during lockdown. Whether that's because people have got more time on their hands, or whether it's just much easier to press join on a meeting than it is otherwise. So that's a great good news story. New trustees during lockdown, incredible.
Thank you. So the question is, are there any thoughts on the furlough scheme and how to best manage staff on the scheme, and whether full-time or part-time? I think there's quite a lot of flexible furlough being used, sort of to best manage the resources of the charity, I guess, but also to meet your the purposes and activities of the charity at this time.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think really the main thing to say is that know the rules and the guidance inside out, and consider it in the light of your circumstances. I think that there's nothing particular to say about that in terms of hints and tips, other than you just obviously need to make sure you're complying with the rules around it. But the rules are actually, of course, very, very flexible, and so there is kind of need to do that. But it is also quite easy to fall foul of them. It's a little bit like the gift aid or small donation scheme. It's just like this, in some ways it's generous, but in other ways it's just so hard to kind of get it right. If there's particular questions about particular aspect of the scheme, do get in touch with us. We'd love to help you out.
Great, okay. So I'm just ticking off some that we've covered. So there was a scenario that I thought would be good for you to just have a little think about when you were thinking about possibly on the verge of sort of the going concern end and how you best manage that. I think, Ed, you were covering that a bit. I think we've seen some charities where there's sort of low end of unrestricted funds may have cash, but that might be due to sort of receiving restricted funds in this time. What sort of actions are you thinking about for a charity in a scenario like that to be taking, perhaps with funders?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be very aware how serious it is to be in a situation where your unrestricted funding is very, very low, where your reserves are very low, but you do have restricted funding in there. What we need to remember is that restricted funds are subject to legal special trust. So they're there and they have to be deployed and used for the purposes for which they have been given. Now, it is common for there to be a very, very short-term borrowing of restricted funds to handle a kind of a cash flow dip or something like that. You need to be very, very careful with that, and that needs to be something that isn't prolonged. I think the important thing to remember so often with restricted funds is that somewhere those restricted funds, they're somewhere down the line, there's been a donor. And it goes back to the point that I said earlier on about communication. Proactive, clear communication is really, really important. I think what's been good to see in many cases that donors have recognized, yes, we gave you this money for this purpose. We are contracting you, or we have, we've given you this grant to deliver this. We recognize that times are exceptional, and therefore we want to slightly widen the scope of that restriction, or we want to, allow you to use something different. That proactive conversation is really important. Where you don't know the donor, that is very much more tricky, and there'd be a need there for Charity Commission intervention and involvement. But it's important to be clear, you may have cash in your bank account, but if that is primarily restricted funds, that's not a particularly comfortable place to be in as you plan going forward. Josh, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that yourself.
No, I think that's really helpful. And I think it's the first port of call. I mean, you've got to take in the whole environment of the charity in that instance. I think talking to the funders is 100% like a really strong step to make there. Obviously, you'll be looking at all the options. It'll be one of a range that you'll be thinking about, whether that's government support, other support that you'll be applying for. You're obviously looking at cost reduction methods as well. But yeah, certainly it would be the first one to be thinking, or a good one to be looking at as well. I've got one here that's sort of looking at the same situation, but from the other angle. So you might be a grant-making organisation, and then you're being approached by the people that you're funding to either change the scope of what they're doing or widen that scope. And I think it's a bit of a nuanced question because on the one hand, do you support them in, or continue to support them in changing that object? But then you're also playing with the fact that it might take their work outside of the objects of your charity, and you've got to be really careful.
Absolutely.
What do people need to be thinking about there, especially in the context of COVID-19 and the sort of the wider public benefit sort of stuff?
I'll make a brief comment first, and then maybe Cecile would like to pick up as well. But I think the really important thing to recognise is to always return to the core duties of trusteeship, and to remember that actually there is a need always to be acting in the best interests of your charity. It's wonderful to be in the charity sector. It's wonderful to do great stuff. It's wonderful to do good things. But as my colleague Cecile has quite often said, you have got to do the good that you have been set up to do. And so acting within your charitable purposes is the way in which you act in your charity's best interest, and it's vitally important. Now, obviously, in those discussions, you need to figure out, what are the ways within our charitable purposes we might be able to tweak and change what we're offering to be able to do, because making that grant is all about delivering on what we're set up to do. There are kind of, in very, very exceptional cases, it might be that there's a kind of a need for a long-term shift in the focus of the charity for some reason. And that's where, a very kind of rigorous discussion would be needed about whether there is a change of or a widening of objects. But that's not a short-term thing. That is a very kind of big decision and a fundamental one. Cecile, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. A couple of things to add to that, really. Don't confuse objectives, as in strategic priorities, with your charitable purposes, your objects. That's quite common and potentially quite high risk. The objects are an absolute, so you simply can't go beyond them. And if you do, you put the charity at risk and trustees put themselves at risk. So if you're genuinely thinking that this is something that there's reason to do, you need to get Charity Commission consent to any formal change, and you must get that in advance. A change isn't effective unless you get it in advance. So refocusing activities within the objects is something that generally charity trustees will be able to do. Actually going outside of them, it's a don't do it until you've got a good case, you've made the case, and you've succeeded in getting your consent from the Commission.
Mm. It's worth noting, Ed and I are both trustees of charities, and one of the charities that we happen to be trustee of together historically has ended up with quite wide objects, although our activities are quite, we wouldn't do everything that is allowed by our objects and in our constitution. So although perhaps the donor is doing something that you approve of isn't within your normal range of activities, as long as it's within that objects that you were set up to achieve, then you should still be able to allow it if you would like to pursue that direction.
It's very much a difference between can and should, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. I have something interesting here, I think, for you, Cecile. We've been talking about board meetings and whether they can go ahead electronically. We've got somebody whose constitution allows for, unusually, the board meetings to go ahead electronically, but not members' meetings. They need to be done physically. But unfortunately, you can't, in this governing document, you can't appoint, it might be a bit specific here, but you can't appoint trustees without a members' meeting. And so they're a bit stuck in this time. I was thinking maybe towards a little bit of a tweak to their governing documents, but maybe you've got a solution that could help them.
I think that's one we need to talk to you individually about.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. We have a sort of a rare person here who is a potential charity trustee, but doesn't have a particular charity in mind. Is there there might be hopefully many people on the call who are a bit like this, but is there someone somewhere that this individual might be directed to think about?
Well, it's been great to read on the chat. There's a number of people that have suggested the ones getting on board. Sounds like it is a great thing. Vosca, we're very aware. Quite often there's trustee vacancies that can be posted. Cecile mentions, well, we have a document that has some kind of sources, some places which you can register interest. But that's, to be honest with you, if you're really interested in being a charity trustee, get in touch with us, because we have a large charity client base, many of whom are looking for trustees, and it might very well be that we can be a little bit of matchmaking for people. So, but yeah, great suggestions on the chat.
And if people would like our document, obviously we'd be happy to send it out to you.
Wonderful. Well, I think in the interest of making sure we close on time, I think I'll wrap up there. If you've got any further questions, do let us know, and we'll see if we can follow up sort of post-meeting on those. So let me just bring up something. Wonderful. So thank you all for your questions and for being with us this afternoon. We really appreciate your presence and your wonderful questions, and of course your ongoing work for the public benefit in each of your charities, whether trustee or management or whatever. So if there is any way that we as Burton Suite can help you, your charities, your trustees, then please do get in touch with us. Some of the things that we could offer to you might be changing your constitution, converting your entity perhaps if you're thinking about moving towards a CIA or something else. If you'd like some time, some advice with whether it's with Ed or Cecile, advising you or training your board of trustees, or whether it's sort of governance matters that you might need some assistance with, or alternatively some sort of technical accounts, audit, independent examination, all of that sort of thing, then we would love to help. Please do let us know. As Ed mentioned earlier, we will be sending out a post-event communication with all the slides and either some audio, but potentially some video for anybody who would like to see it or may have missed the event this morning who did sign up for it. And also, we'd really appreciate your feedback on today to help us make it better. We aim to do quite a few of these over the year, and the next one we're aiming for is to do one sometime in the spring. So your feedback would really help us make it better and make it a better service for you. I thank you all for being with us again, and thank you to both of our speakers, Ed and Cecile. We wish you well today. Take care, and we hope to see you all soon. Thank you,
everybody. Good to see you.
Bye, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Wonderful to see you all.